Well, okay, hello, Internet. My name is Chris Haw, and this is Dr. David Bentley Hart. We're here at Notre Dame University. And on the occasion of the passing of René Girard last week, I made an effort to talk with a few people about the legacy and scholarship of Girard, and maybe do some critical reflection on his ideas as sort of like a video festschrift. So I've prepared a few questions for Dr. Hart here, and we are just going to discuss them. And so, thanks for having me. So just as kind of a general idea for starters, this summer at the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, you had said that you think Girard's work really gets the New Testament right in many ways, and that he offers theology an immense deposit of thought that should be kind of incorporated not just as an acquired taste, but without reserve. I thought that was very interesting. So maybe just as an opening thought, what would you say are the particular things that Girard offers to theology?
Well, you see, that might be too general a question, but when talking about the New Testament, there are certain things about the figure of Christ as the one condemned and then the one vindicated by God that he brings out with a special clarity that, curiously enough, don't figure large enough in a lot of either historically or at present in reflection on the death of Christ. The more atonement theories tended, especially in the West, and not to sound like an orthodox triumphalist, especially in the West, to move towards a specific concern with a kind of transaction enacted between God the Father and God the Son, usually based on a very specific notion of retributive justice. And again, I don't want to indulge in caricatures here, as is often done. Mm-hmm. But this does happen in the later Middle Ages and then in the early modern period with a vengeance in a lot of Tridentine era Catholicism, in all of the magisterial Reformation theologies. The figure of Christ then becomes curiously abstracted from the historical and religious world of the New Testament. And there, something fascinating is going on. All sorts of odd transformations and inversions of perspective that are largely invisible to us now because we've inherited them, or because we've ignored them, because we've inherited other theological interests, but that at the time were quite strikingly novel. Simply, and this can't be stressed enough, I mean, it's simply placed within first century late antiquity, within the Roman imperial world. There's a religious culture in which religio in the full sense, is not simply, in the sense we're often taught to think of this word, that which binds us together, but that which binds all of society and culture together, in which there's no division between the sacred and the profane, except in the trivial sense that there are certain things that are enacted inside temples and certain things that are profane inside of temples. But everything is embraced in the sacred order, and that order is at once cosmic, religious, political, and by political, imperial. Mm-hmm. And this is good. I mean, the early pagans of Christianity found something. We see this in Celsus and in Eunapius of Sardis and in other critics, where we get secondhand, mostly through Christian sources, but with honest reflection of time. What's subversive is the impiety of Christianity, its indifference to the sacred structure of reality that holds all things together. There's something, the notion that Christians have that they have direct access to God, so that the mediating principles of the temple and aerial demons, but also of higher classes within the order of society could be dispensed with. Because again, class is also a religious reality as much as anything else. It's part of the immemorial structure of reality ordained by the gods, preserved perhaps ordained by the Most High God. I mean, it's an increasingly monotheistic picture of reality in the pagan world as well, though with all sorts of intermediating agencies. And there's a rebellion going on against this, at least conceptually. You see it there in the Gospels, in, say, the confrontation of Christ and Pilate. From the perspective of the ancient world, Pilate is completely in the right here. He's a representative of the full political and therefore sacred authority of empire and society. He's upholding law and order against an agent of disorder, a person who before the law is not even a person, he's a colonial, a slave, a criminal. And the full splendor and power of Rome is concentrated in the figure of Pilate. And he has at his command the proof of his divine authority, which he expresses when he says, I have the power to crucify you.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not only the priest of his own household called, as he would have been anyway, according to the patriarch Testus, but it has a kind of, so to speak, priestly role in the orderly administration of the empire, which is under the protection of the gods. And yet the New Testament, for the first time really in Western literary history, presents us with this confrontation on the side of the victim, on the side of Christ, and then emphasizes this with the ultimate vindication, the pronouncement of all the religious authorities and political authorities, and finally the supreme political authority, that's also religious, Rome itself, is overturned decisively. And throughout the New Testament, and through the Old Testament too, but through the New Testament, we see signs of something that is, from the perspective of the first century, an almost total inversion of what would be considered sane, due, and pious truth. Peter weeping at the memory of having betrayed Christ. Peter's a peasant. In the literature of antiquity, he simply cannot be a tragic figure. His tears cannot be objects of serious moral, spiritual concern, and yet here they are. So, I mean, that's just one. I mean, again, I'm rambling more in my own direction.
Well, that's actually one of the questions which I have, which is my being underread in classics and antiquity. It's very possible for somebody like me to have large claims like Girard's, for somebody to pull the wool over my eyes, because he says grand things like, this is the first major reversal that we have of the notion of the lynch group is basically innocent and the victim is in some way or another guilty. Not being...
Well, actually, though, he says that runs throughout Hebrew scripture as well.
Indeed.
Starting with Cain and Abel. So, I mean, for him, it's a constant emerging, but always subtending theme throughout all of the Bible.
Yes.
So,
Indeed so, but
yes.
Seeing that story of the Bible in its broadest sense as very unique, it seems in a way he gets that partly from Nietzsche, who apparently reads Judaism and Christianity as uniquely and unhealthily attending to victims.
Well, Christianity, sometimes Judaism. When he talks of Judaism, it depends on which aspect and which period.
Yeah.
But definitely Christianity for Nietzsche.
Right. So I guess part of the question is, if one had a broader scope of reading, could one allow other things in through that filter? Like Girard in 2003, I think it was, released a book on Hinduism, in which it seemed he modified his reading of Christianity as sort of uniquely revelatory of the single victim mechanism, again, with its Jewish background notwithstanding. But he says we should understand that Hinduism, in some of its strands, is revelatory because it's giving a critical analysis of misapprehension of the sacrificial mechanisms. And that kind of makes me wonder, are there other ways in which what was a Girardian paradigm that sometimes from a distance looks like almost hubristically Christian-centric, will that become a more porous paradigm in which parts of Hinduism are welcomed into, being perceived as revelatory, or even parts of Buddhism as dealing with desire? I know you're read in the East more than me, so what would you say on this?
Yeah, no, look, grand claims are always interesting as a starting point, but they should never be the terminus ad quem. There's both a truth and an overstatement in the earlier perspective. There is something unique in the way in which Christianity unveils the mechanism that I think he's correctly identified, if universalized a little too hastily, in the sense that the mechanism may be everywhere, but it's not an explanation of everything, in quite the way he sometimes makes it sound. Nonetheless, there is something that is unique, but it's in Christianity unique in intensity, unique in degree, unique in clarity. But in a sense, that's inevitable because you're making it because Christianity is the religion of the vindicated victim, and it's set within a particular sacred context, in a particular point in human history, at the intersection of two different sacrificial cultures that were already very developed. Hinduism, well, to the degree there is such a thing, this is a Vedic religion, which takes in all the orthodox paths of Hinduism, has a history that also very early on shows a kind of fatigue with the logic and metaphysics of sacrifice. So you can read in the Rig Veda the story of the primal man Purusha, whose sacrifice is necessary to bring about the creation of the world, which is what in Norse mythology here is the same sort of figure. And and the Brahmanas, which are commentaries, when we talk about the Vedas in the West, we mean the four principal Vedas, but actually in Vedic tradition it takes in the Vedas plus the Brahmanas, which are the ritual descriptions of how, say, the sacrifice is performed, how other things are done. The Aranyakas, which are commentary, and the Upanishads, which are much later spiritual commentary. So that whole development is already contained within the Vedic inheritance. And there you see a gradual disenchantment with the Lord of sacrifice. The same thing happens in Buddhism, which is an Upanishadic religion. It's a school that fits within that same tradition, in which the sacrifice, the traditional Vedic sacrifices are seen as more and more fruitless. But also, you see, from a very early period, surprisingly, considering that these cults, cults in the proper sense, that is, these specific religious practices, come from a society that was a herding culture, that was reliant on cattle. From a very early period, you begin seeing signs of an uneasy conscience with regard to the sacrifice of animals. Now we know there's Vedic talk of the sacrifice of a human being, but whether it was ever performed or not, or whether this has like a ritual that would describe it. We certainly find no evidence that this was something that was done. But already the conscience is being pricked at the thought of the harmless cow. And one of the odd inversions in the history of Indian religion is just go to India today, the cows wandering the streets unmolested, very violent and inviolable. And that goes back very deeply into Indian history to realization that the economy of violence that sustains the cosmos sustains itself as violence, and the religious sensibility of Indian religion becomes more and more liberation from the cycle, not just liberation from suffering, but liberation from the cruelty of the sacrificial logic of terrestrial life. This is true in Buddhism, it's true in Pranashanic Hinduism, it's true not only in the high philosophical regions of the various forms of Vedanta, Advaita, Vaika, but in Buddhism as well, and sort of reaches a kind of beautiful intensity, say, in the Mahayana forms of Buddhism, in which progressively the ideal shifts from what the Mahayana would call Pratyeka Buddha, who strives only for his own liberation, becomes more and more the liberation of the bodhisattva figure, who's a savior figure, who comes to precisely to liberate from this sort of blood-soaked cycle, this inescapable blood-soaked cycle. So that's a very long answer to a simple question. I'm sorry for that, but the truth is, what I want to say is there is a uniqueness in Christianity, in the sense that it might be that we could not recognize kindred recognitions in other faiths if it weren't for the resplendently obvious revelation in the Christian story. Still, that said, it is a more radical, disruptive, punctiliar rupture in Christian culture. It happens once and for all in a decisive way that then forms the entire imagination and has it leads to radical visions of religious thought, of cultural thought, and that you probably can't find elsewhere.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind in trying to filter the similarities and differences with Christianity and Hinduism regarding the sacrificial mechanism, Chesterton comes to mind when what comes to mind is when he says, the difference between resurrection and reincarnation is completely inverse. As far as the resurrection, what we have is something that makes you now distrust a king, because a king could be a potential pilot, and maybe trust the poor, because for all you know, he may be the son of man.
Yeah.
But reincarnation would be basically precisely the opposite by its effect, which is distrust the poor, trust the king.
That's always a danger, although remember, again, Chesterton's knowledge of Indian religion was rather fatuous, to be honest. He sort of and it's not necessarily his fault. There was a lot of charlatanism filtering into Britain at the time. But he didn't have a very sophisticated understanding of the teachings. Now, at the vulgar level, that does happen. I mean, you can get, there is a kind of, at times in certain Buddhist culture, say in Tibet, a remarkable resignation to social inequities. It's not necessarily that they are simply the fruit of karma, but that the way past them stretches out into eons. On the other hand, remember that it's a principal teaching that to have a more exalted position in society is not necessarily simply a blessing. A king can actually be farther from enlightenment in developed Indian thought, much farther from enlightenment than say, a Shudra. Although strict limits will be put on caste duties and the degree of religious study that's allowed. For instance, you really, one of the things you can strive for, say, in many systems of Hindu thought, is strive to be reborn as a god. Ideally, you shouldn't, because gods cannot find enlightenment. They're too happy. They exist in a state of bliss, and the result is this sort of idiot glee of the gods leads to their downfall. This is what the god of death Yama tells Nachiketas. I strove for all those years to become a god, and then I find it ephemeral in the end, and have to return. Fall from this eminence. And this is true of kings too. I mean, the teaching of Punabandha, it's not saying reincarnation, but re-becoming, is not that you can just read off from social station, social circumstance, what is just. In fact, karma isn't really a law of justice. It's not something resident in the mind of God in that sense. Karma is simply a kind of pitiless law of causality. So, yeah, I know there's some truth to this. There's a great deal of truth to this, perhaps. Christianity is more socially disruptive. That is part of its unique power and genius. But again, I want these realizations always to be within the embrace of a broader sense of the qualifications and cautions you have to make. You have to add any completely peremptory statement,
Right.
Especially when you're trying to make assertions, as Chesterton is often doing, about traditions you really know nothing about.
Yeah. I think I hit my limit with Chesterton when he says, I can imagine two things no more unlike each other than Christianity and Buddhism. While he may have a point on questions of the nothing, which I guess pseudodiagnosis.
You see, I could imagine a great number of things much more alike, and so could he.
Yeah, I know. I mean, especially having read that, I think it was the Buddha who said, whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. So we could just put Chesterton, at least on that one, in the bin for a moment. Well, here's my, speaking of the nothing, or the Nile, or the maybe pseudo-Dionysian type question, is this long question on the movement from the sacred to the holy, which I gave David permission to fall asleep to while I read, because it's like 3 paragraphs. So
just pass the bourbon.
Okay. So Girard hypothesized that the idea of God originates in proto-humanity from a misapprehension. God, or the sacred, is an externalization of our violence, epitomized in the chaos of lynch mobs. So that is, the transcendent thought, the beginnings of transcendent thought, may originate in humans in which our minds have now a contrasted background or an objective distance through a collectively murdered victim, who, while no longer is visible and present, and may be hidden under a pile of our rocks now, is still saving us in its absence. Von Balthasar critiqued him for this, saying that this now implies that there's no natural idea of God, by which I guess that he meant there's no originally pacific, good, and pure idea of God at bottom. So this insight doesn't lead Girard to some of the more simplistic types of atheism that you've critiqued in Hitchens and Dawkins, but a sense that we're on a different territory here.
Right.
Yeah. But a sense that our view of God is radically but slowly evolving, or maybe even dissolving. That is, because of Christ's innocent passion and resurrection, because it punctures the false sacred, which is based on a mythical misapprehension of guilt and victims, we're moving away from the sacred to the holy. That is, from a Janus two-faced notion of a God who loves us dearly, but also threatens us with infinite torture, to the God of pure light, pure unconditionality beyond comprehension. So this movement, which has shades of Hölderlin and Marion, means an embrace of absence. Scott Cowdell writes of this: togetherness and personal security are typically rooted in a violent compact and its mythico-ritual reinforcement, so that the price of our true liberation for a future of genuine humanity and self-determination is the risk of isolation, exposure, and emotional flatness. This is because the false sacred has been punctured. Disenchantment is thus the price of Christian maturity and closeness to God, as St. John of the Cross intuited at the onset of modernity with his dark night. This dark night is actually the paradox of true divine presence in the dwindling to nothing of false sacred power over us. In other words, from battling to the end, Christ withdraws at the very point when he could dominate. We, in turn, are thus required to experience the peril of the absence of God, the modern experience par excellence. Dorothy Sola corresponds here in her call to suffer with God, the godlessness of the world, or Chauvet and Heidegger in their poetic call to maintain a mature proximity to the absence of the presence of God and the presence of the absence of God. So kind of weigh in on this interplay of moving from the sacred to the holy.
I think there were about 5 questions
Yeah.
there, really. So I might need you to recapitulate certain things along the way. First of all, just start with the concept of God and the movement of this from the sacred to the holy. Again, a partial truth can become a total falsehood if you try to make it an absolute explanation. And it's a question of what exactly we're talking about here. It's not always clear in Girard. Is he saying that the idea of God as such, that there is a God, is from the beginning prompted by this, so to speak, cultural memory of the violent transaction of exclusion and murder? Or is he saying that in the natural notion of God, which is simply a universal reality that Paul points to, which is that the mind looks up to the heavens, the eyes look up to the heavens, and says, this doesn't have to be here.
Yeah.
There's a reason why. And with it, countless forms of natural piety that are perfectly pacific and reverent and generous, and consist quite often in nothing more than the offer of prayer and some flowers and sort of share a community sense of the holy thing. If you were denying that is also at the ground of our religious experience, you'd be saying something self-evidently false. I think historically but logically you can see that couldn't possibly be true. But if what he's saying is all of our ideas of God are corrupted from the beginning as well by the economy of the sacred, in which we can't clearly separate in our mind this peaceful apprehension of God as the infinite source of things, to whom returns peace or reconciliation, and the cultic sacrificial economy that underlies the mythology of most developed or even partly developed cultures. He's saying that that's in some sense true. The two go hand in hand just about everywhere from an early point. And again, also the tension between the two is experienced everywhere. India is a wonderful example. Again, is that it's not the case that there's one thing called Hinduism that has a structure of doctrines and beliefs that's it's a history of descent and departures. The Upanishadic exhaustion with the sacrificial world is a turn towards a completely different understanding of the relation of God to the world, of Brahman to the world that comes from this contingent upon God. And the way of return is not by sustaining the cosmic cycle of sacrifice, but actually is a spiritual reconciliation between God, who is not a source of sacrificial violence, and a spirit that in its depths is already one with God. And the ethos that emerges from this in Buddhism, which you could say is not theistic, but you have to be very careful what you're saying, because it's considered. And in much, and in that it becomes the developed Vedantic and Bhaktic tradition is ahimsa, doing no harm. We see this also in Jainism, which is as old or older than Buddhism, as old as. And though it's non-Vedic and therefore not Hindu in the classic sense, it's another example of a departure from trust in the violence of the sacred. That said, so that's one of the 57 questions in that question.
Mm-hmm.
That said, it remains the case that the violence of the sacred is a real thing to be diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Girard is quite right about that, and it expresses itself not only as something in the past that has been superseded, but is in sort of continuous alloy with the other aspect. And this creates extreme contradictions and tensions. I mean, Christianity is the most, if you're going to look at it in purely historical terms, you say it's the most successful religion in history, in the sense that it's, with Islam made one day, it's exceeded in this, but so far Christianity is spread widest and have the greatest number of social and cultural ramifications and so on and so forth. Or at least Christendom has. But it's also, as classically formulated again and again, a religious story that seems full of irreconcilable tensions at times. Now again, I'm not trying to sound like an orthodox triumphalist, I'm just saying it gets, in a sense, worse in the Western half of Christendom, simply because of certain classic late 4th century or 5th century misprisions of Paul's theology of grace. And then much later, it's often incorrectly ascribed to Anselm, but there are later, at least in early modernity and the late Middle Ages, models of atonement which are just retributive. So that in the New Testament, the Litron, the price of liberation paid by Christ on the cross, which is an image from civil law about the manumission fee for a slave, is imagined as a ransom paid to the Father. Mm-hmm. This you see taken, and the death of Christ on the cross as an example of the wrath of the Father poured out. The sort of substitutionary account in Calvinism at its worst, which would be at its normal, to be honest, I mean, is just this. I mean, it is a total fatalism in which God predestines even the first sin in order to bring about a display of His glory. And to display that glory involves the damnation of the vast majority of humanity. And even this, those who escape it purely, almost by divine caprice, under the canopy of God's implacable wrath being poured out on an innocent victim. This is such a degenerate picture of God that atheism is clearly a spiritually superior stance to take.
It's almost akin to creating the world out of the body of the victim.
Yeah,
like
it is. Except that at least in the latter, that happens as a result of certain, at least in the early mythic strata, as a result of certain limitations. You need material. There is a kind of self-giving there, almost a chemesis. There isn't, when you get to the early modern picture of God, there is no self-giving, there's self-expression, there's expression of pure selfity. Now, this isn't the shape, and I think this is a later question, so forgive me if I trespass on a different question. This isn't the New Testament picture of atonement. And it isn't the early patristic picture. There, the language is still that we're being liberated from slavery, we're being healed of the disease. It's always God coming to rescue us in Christ, not God demanding a price. And even this is true, even Athanasius, his language of atonement, if you read it correctly, and it's true of Anselm too, it's not a wrath offering that's being demanded. Rather, there has to be a restoration of righteousness in which God takes up the part that we've let fall. So He suffers on our behalf the pains of obedience in a fallen world.
Yeah.
But by early modernity, you really do have these models. Now, it's also the case that it seems to me a contradiction that you touched on deeply written, in the tradition, and definitely the undisputed dominant claims since the 5th century at least, that God loves you infinitely, so much so that he'll torture you infinitely to express how much he loves you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, Calvinism doesn't have this problem because actually Calvin explicitly denies that God is love in any ultimate sense.
Yeah. Okay.
It says that's not actually one of the attributes of God, and his exegesis of the Jacobite epistles is that's how he is experienced by the elect.
Hmm.
So God is hate too, if you're not the elect.
Right.
But within real Christianity, within the tradition as it actually comes from the New Testament, the picture of God is of one who graciously comes to save and loves all and wills that all should be saved. This is quite explicitly stated in patristics-at-large, that every human being should be saved, without exception. Still, what came, the eschatological language of the New Testament came to be interpreted very questionably, I would say, in a specific way about a future day at which Christ will condemn multitudes to eternal misery. That being so, that contradiction that's written in the very fabric of Christianity is one of the sources of secularization, it seems to me. There are all other sorts of causes you can invoke which are equally important. The rise of capitalism, with the nation state as a self-justifying entity, total sovereignty, all these things. But part of it is, and certainly early modern forms of Christianity which are morally inferior to atheism, such as this sort of double predestinarian vision, not of the Calvinists, but of the Dominican school of Thomism, mostly Dominican, not exclusively. And in a sense, the moral exhaustion with that picture of God is almost is a healthy thing. In that case, a kind of nihilism, a kind of atheism that will not have anything to do with that God is a spiritually healthy recognition of the contradiction. So that leads to the end of your question. Yes, it's a long question, so it's a long answer. How to take secularization? Again, just don't make a total statement about such things. There is a sense in which it is very true that secularization, the dark side of it is the violence. It itself not only perpetuates but creates new kinds of violence. The absolute claims of the sovereignty of the nation state. What are called the wars of religion in early modernity. In fact, wars of the nation state breaking free of certain religious compacts, more tacit than real anyway. And the project of secular humanity, far from being the perpetual peace that Kant envisaged, can be just as well understood as forging the master race or the perfect socialist utopia, or a genetically perfected species, or whatever. And that can lead and has led to violence on an unbelievable scale. That too is part of the story of secularization. But if we're talking about secularization as a progressive exhaustion with the violence of the sacred within the understanding of the holy, if we make this distinction, which is worth making, then yeah, it's a time of spiritual probation in which, thank God, Christians don't wield political power. That there is no institutional church that is also a compact with the state, thrown in altar. I don't want to single out Thomas here. It's just that he's so much more systematic than anyone else. When he wrote his famous arguments for why heretics have to be put to death. Now think about this. I mean, when Priscillian was executed by a pretender emperor for Spanish hinterlands for perceived heresy, this was a scandal to the bishops and theologians who this was the notion that heresy could be the cause of doing something that to that point was associated principally with the pagan state, that is, imposition and execution for violation of sacred boundaries and protocols. By the time of Thomas, he's just stating it as a given that the responsibility of the church for the souls of the baptized and for the order of Christian culture requires that the heretic may be given one chance to repent. If recidivism then follows, even if he repents, he's still going to have to be executed. And he makes the distinction, which of course is the classic distinction. The church provides the arraignment, the secular law provides the axe, or sword, or flames, or rope. So basically what he said at that point is that in order for the sacred order of society and for the mission of the church to baptize souls to be properly prosecuted, the church has to assume the role of Caiaphas, and the secular arm the role of Pilate. And we recapitulate the very order that crucified Christ. Now, okay, the heretic may not be Christ, but nonetheless, the sacred order is. When you reach that point, you realize that the sheer power, the incredibly, almost invincible power of the paradigm that the Gospels seem to subvert, and do subvert. It's just the case that modern secular culture, in some ways, as a result of the collapse of Christendom, and sub contrario, and under any number of massive misconceptions regarding the philosophical and spiritual basis of its own moral prejudices, nonetheless is more habitable for genuine Christian life in many ways than Christendom could be.
Yeah.
So we can lament the desacralization of culture if we want. But we should recognize, first of all, it's our fault. I mean, secularism only occurs in Christian cultures, and it occurs because of contradictions in that we were willing to tolerate and perpetuate over generations, and that there is now a spiritual opportunity, perhaps, to see that in a condition of cultural indigence and weakness, the gospel can reassert itself over against the unbreakable compact of Caiaphas and Pilate.
Were you familiar with this passage from Chauvet that I'm referring to, of his attempt to maintain the proximity to the absence of the presence, and the presence of the absence?
Well, the thing is, I may or may not be, that same sentence in one or another form is such a, is almost, to be honest, a platitude. It's so common in 20th century talk, in the shadow of Heidegger, under the wings of Hegel, meaning different things.
Talk about the way that it's sort of lost any content to it.
Well, it hasn't lost content to me. I'm just saying that I wouldn't recognize that sentence plucked out of 150 other sentences very much like it.
Yeah.
So I may have read it or may not have done. There are many different ways of taking it. Some of them can be sort of silly. I tend to think that, for instance, John Caputo, or others who want this completely non-metaphysical, not a non-metaphysical Christianity, but one evacuated of transcendence. They take kenosis not as a part of this, not as the story of the reconciliation of the transcendent and the created, but an exhaustion of the one into the other. And supposedly this exhausts violence, whereas in point of fact, if you take it very seriously, there'd be no reason why it would do that. It would be inverted Hegelianism. It's just the story of the violence of evidence becomes total, because there is no transcendent context of ontological peace that it dissembles.
No contrastive background.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, there's no truth apart from sheer immanence, and it's I find that banal. I have no interest in that. But culturally, as the recognition that the absence of a particular or several particular pictures of God can also be a healing, and the first difficult, traumatic experience of the absence of a God whose presence was monstrous. The God of early modern theology is, to a great degree, capriciously voluntarist, a nominalist God whose even the moral order of whose creation is arbitrary in a sense, because it's all contingent on the exercise and display of sovereignty rather than the inevitable revelation of the good as such that he is. It's been utterly denuded of that metaphysical language that affirms that God's freedom consists in the absence of constraints upon the expression of his love and goodness, and becomes the wielding arbitrary power. That God is worse than any devil could ever be, because he's omnipotent and nonetheless is morally contemptible. The loss of that God brings one closer to the holy. I think that's true.
Yeah.
And as I said, I would rather, if it's a choice between being an absolutely orthodox Calvinist who takes seriously Book 3 of the Institutes as the true measure of the Christian faith, and being a total atheist, the latter is what I would recommend, because then you're closer to God. You've embraced accidentally, inadvertently, confusedly, a kind of apophatic rejection of this idolatrous picture of God as some strutting, imbecile tyrant on high who's cruel just for the sake of showing that he can be cruel. There's Suetonius tells the story of how Domitian once honored a steward by having him sit with him on his couch at dinner and eat from his own plate, and then the next morning had him crucified, exalted him, and tortured him to death. And this seems to have been just a playful demonstration of absolute power. We can say it's a revelation of glory. That picture of God as Domitian omnipotence is very much the early modern picture, and one that he's a God who had to be killed.
Yeah.
And we still have to work to kill him. Not violently, kill him with love.
But it seems some that have taken that path of rejecting the God who kills, or who has a threat behind his love, is a turn right after Auschwitz, at least, of rejecting a God who saves as well. I recall reading recently somebody saying somebody prayed in thanksgiving to God after having not been delivered into this gas chamber, and his neighbor said, God spits on your prayer, for thanking God that you didn't go into the gas chambers. So it seems that certain theologies after Auschwitz also want, for the sake of honesty, for the sake of, I don't know, like a full deconstruction, to not just remove the Calvinistic God of threat, but the Calvinistic God of saving.
I don't want the Calvinist God of saving. The Calvinist God of saving is not worth having as a savior, because it is a love that, again, is utterly arbitrary and it's counterbalanced by far greater circumscribing darkness of hatred, pure hatred towards those who are not elect. He hates them because they are not elect. But, yeah, well, first of all, I want to point out that you can take the most universalist figures in Christian history, like Gregory of Nyssa, or Isaac the Syrian, or George MacDonald, if you want to. They all have pretty clear notion of hell, too. I mean, they see in God, not God as wrath, but nonetheless, God, that the holy is pure. And if you're really going to talk about the holy as opposed to the sacred isn't pure, it's simply restricted territory. It's a temenos within a temple. But what goes on in that temple is sacrifice, Sibylline possession, whatever. But it's not holy in the sense that the notion of God as pure light and peace that you would find. We don't have to be Christian about this again. The difference of the Upanishadic understanding of the relation between Brahma and Atman and the sacrificial economy of the Brahmin order, the Brahmin caste, and the Kshatriya caste too. So, excuse me. Nonetheless, the holy is something that we can approach only by becoming holy, and that's always a condition, a reciprocal empty. Just as the Philippians hymn says that the Son of God didn't, evacuated himself of his glory and took on the form of a slave. It is by being crucified to the world that the form of the slave becomes also the form of the son or daughter of God. And that inheritance of the kingdom says, what's the only, the Apostle Paul, our earliest Christian writings, when he talks about salvation and judgment, nowhere in there does he talk about an eternal hell, for instance. He never mentions this. The only point at which he talks about the suffering and judgment, 1 Corinthians, where he talks about those whose works are tried by fire. And the distinction there is those whose works stand the test of fire, because contrary to the venerable Augustinian reading of Paul actually did believe in judgment. Orthodox, the grace only or salvation by works is not a distinction. Paul, there is a distinction between works of the law and trying to achieve salvation simply by observances, ritual observances, and recognizing that the works of love that are impressed in the soul by God's grace stretch before and beyond and outside the boundaries of the law. That's a different distinction. But he says simply that there are those whose works stand the test of fire and those whose works don't. What happens then? Their works are consumed as so much straw or stubble, though they themselves will be saved as if by fire. And I think that if one takes the recognition that the kind of nihilistic tyrant God of early modern Western theology, especially, is an idol that needs to be shattered. That doesn't change the grave reality of sin and death and violence that we harbor within ourselves, and that to be set free from these things is a cautery. It's giving up what I think is most precious about myself. It is judgment. It is damnation. In a sense, that which is damnable is to be destroyed. Now, as for theologies after Auschwitz, I'm going to just say I don't think there's an answer that's going to satisfy anyone, and not even an answer I could give.
Mm.
There you step back, and all you can do is sort of point to the cross of Christ and hope that explains without explaining. But I'm not going to. It would be, I think, shameful to dare to answer that. Mm-hmm. Just because the enormity of both natural and moral evils is so great that to pretend that is not the one powerful argument against faith in the goodness of God, one that has to be, the only one that has to be taken seriously, I think would be silly.
I've heard some people read Girard as quite consonant with some patristic authors, but not being as versed in patristics myself, I can't really say much about that. The only thing that I've picked up recently is Justin's first apology, where Justin basically admits that Christ's structural similarity with the killed and resurrected gods of his day. He mentions Zeus and Hermes and Dionysus, but insists not that Christ's resurrection historically happened and theirs didn't, but that such gods were demons. And it seems Girard kind of is doing some of the same thing when, through Nietzsche, he says Christ is exactly like Dionysus in a certain structural sense, but in reverse, regarding the whole lynching question. But my knowledge of patristics is
well, I mean, looking for you're not going to find that kind of typological cross-cultural reading. In the early centuries of the Church, the apologetic context being what it was, Justin's understanding is fairly common. Is that remember, the word daemon in Greek is entirely innocuous. It just is a divinity, typically an aerial divinity, or just a word for a god. And it becomes, it shifts in Christian usage. So it becomes opprobrious, it's sort of like the way in Persian culture in which Deva becomes the devil, so to speak, whereas in northern India, which emerges from the same original Indo-European linguistic and religious background, Deva becomes like Deus, the privileged word for the divine beings, and Azuras or Ahuras, and in Persian becomes the name of the devils, the sort of older Titanic strain of God. And so the same thing happens in Christianity. There's a rejection and so an inversion of the sacred claims. That's not what's interesting. What is interesting, though, is that before a certain period, before the New Testament started to be progressively read outside its cultural and even legal context, the language of the New Testament and the language of the New Testament moved farther and farther away from the epoch in which it was born. Models of salvation were models of rescue. I mean, the thing that, why a totally Gnostic notion of a Gnostic Savior is still closer to the Christianity of the early centuries than, say, a 16th century substitutionary atonement, is because both understand the action of God as an entirely unified descent into our world, into death, into hell, into our hearts, to rescue from death and from violence and from discord and from all the things that divide, the divisions of peoples. I mean, that's the thing that Paul finds most magnificent and strange, is that the walls of division have fallen. Those divisions were considered sacred and inviolable too in their own way in antique culture. And so the model of salvation is one of recapitulation, of on the one hand, in Irenaeus, or of reconciliation, of healing, and rescue, of being brought out of slavery. But it's entirely that and not, and most definitively not, the story of a God whose wrath requires appeasement or of a sacrifice offered to God. It's funny when you take the 4th century is really a great period for the coalescence of the doctrinal tradition of what would become great church Christianity, or even the Christianity not only the Orthodox, the Catholics, but also the so-called Oriental churches. This is the 4th century, not the 5th. The most fertile period, and Gregory of Nyssa in the Oratia Catechetics, to whom the literal, what's often translated as ransom, is paid. And he said there are two possibilities. Is it paid to death or is it paid to the devil? It never occurs to him to say is it paid to God, because God is the one paying, and certainly God doesn't want to hold us in bondage.
Yes.
He's come to rescue us.
Yeah.
Gregory the theologian, Gregory Nazianzen, that is, says, well, it's not paid to anyone. It's just, the devil doesn't deserve it either. And so it just, we just understand the way you say that that's the price that had to be paid for this thing. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a recipient, but there's a cost. But no one thinks it's paid to the Father. It's just not. It's not even a conceivable notion that there'd be this weird sacrificial economy within God. On the one hand, we have the nice God who's doing the dying, and then the God and this is true even of Athanasius. Again, God's trying to rescue his righteousness because it's the foundation of creation. He's not trying to appease his wrath. So, in order that the agathotes, the goodness of God and of creation be preserved, and God not violate his own goodness, he takes our part. I mean, that's what's going on. It's not that he's demanding that a price be paid. It's that he takes the part of the one who yields all lovingly to the Father, and in that pays the price to death, the devil, whatever, overcomes the estrangement of earth from heaven, of God, of humanity from God, of creation from the divine. And so, Girard's reading of the Gospel fits very easily within the context of the early church and its understanding of salvation, essentially, as rescue, reconciliation, reparation, and healing, enacted by a God of love and peaceful act, and a God of love over against a world of falsehood, violence, and death. So
this would make sense why the sector that it seems most theologians that work with Girard very quickly go to is the atonement sector.
Yeah.
That's where I see most of it.
Right, well that's, the truth is, the theology of the atonement is one area of Christian hope that almost, without being noticed, went through extraordinary transformation over the centuries. What's Athanasius trying to do in De Incarnatione? He gives you 5 or 6 different stories of atonement, or models, if you will, or anything. All the church fathers of the early church, and this is just as much true of Augustine as the Cappadocians, are talking about the gates of hell, of death, of Hades being broken open, and in very strong language, say like Cyril of Alexandria, completely evacuated. Hell has completely, so the devil is there all by himself now. Again, that kind of universalistic language were very common in the first 4 or 5 centuries of the church, gets institutionally and otherwise discouraged as the centuries go on. But that sort of total cosmic triumphalism is very much part. But it used to be said that there was never a church council about the atonement, and so therefore it wasn't an interesting doctrinal. Well, that's not true. All the church councils were about atonement theology. That was the context in which they understood everything. What Trinitarian languages, what Christological languages, it's all in order to understand it within the soteriological narrative. Nicaea is a perfect example. Why the Son and Spirit? Well, Nicaea and Constantinople. Why are Son and Spirit must they be co-equal with the Father? It's precisely because the narrative of salvation is that God joins us to himself in perfect union with the purpose of deification. Only God can join us to God. We're joined to the Father in Christ, to Christ in mediation of the Holy Spirit and sanctification and sacrament. And therefore, so the Trinitarian theology is all about atonement. The atonement understood there very specifically as union, at one. It's only very much later, and much later than most people realize. Again, people always point at Anselm as always the villain here, but if you actually read Pro Deus Homo, even though the argument about the atonement is limited, and it's incomplete and defective, and it doesn't talk about the resurrection, it doesn't talk about the union of natures very much. Nonetheless, it's still not a retributive model, and that's how it's always misread. Yeah. It's very late. But because the atonement is everything, I mean, it embraces everything, it pervades everything, it's never isolated as a dogmatic locus in Christian history, and so it goes through bizarre transformations. I mean, again, I keep bringing up Calvin just because I have an almost irrational dislike of the man and his theology. But when you get to his arguments about the atonement, they literally have nothing. I mean, nothing recognizable in common with the patristic or the Pauline language of atonement, or anything I can find in the New Testament. And how does that happen? And he thinks he's reading it right off of Paul. And he could read Greek, unlike Augustine or Thomas. But he's reading it through an inherited tradition at that point. How does that happen? Well, it happens for any number of reasons. And one of them certainly is because there are certain stories that fit in nicely with the institutional realities of church and culture. A sort of juridical picture of the relation between throne and altar, church and society, faith and obedience to the church. In that context, this narrative makes more sense. I mean, God is a sovereign. God is the prince of the church or of society. He is a sovereign and therefore has demands, and his legitimacy as sovereign is expressed both in unmerited leniency and irresistible wrath.
Okay. Any last words on what you would suggest as pitfalls and critiques to bear in mind as people following upon Girard's death?
Well, I mean, the problem is it becomes a system. I mean, that's the problem with the system. You know, I always make the joke that if there's a hell for theologians, it will consist in Thomists, Holomites, and Barthians sitting in a circle yelling at each other. Because the people who built systems around the figures tend not to do them any great service. I mean, Baroque Thomism was not at all interesting, but Thomas is interesting, you know. And so, and the problem with the danger with Girard's narrative is it's so powerful, and it is so, I think, usefully, critically correct on certain aspects of the gospel, and has such a particular inflection. René's quite said it, is that people then will turn it into a global narrative, and it becomes sort of a hat trick, you know, something to answer every question or understand everything. And, you know, it's just not going to work. There are aspects of religious history and of cultural history that you can't adequately account for. And I think he realized that too. And it's so I mean, to me, that's the great danger: is to forget that Girard had a powerful insight and one that's fairly narrowly focused. I mean, he's not a person. It's not like his books are always. It's not always coming up with new ideas.
Yeah.
He's just refining and qualifying and refining some more of this essential insight. Is if you turn that into the whole story, you're going to lose not only the real power of what he's saying, you'll banalize it really, you'll make it trivial, but then you also will fail to notice the richness and ambiguity of the traditions and the historical realities you're talking about. So, I mean, that's my one caution. He made an altogether precious contribution to how we think about the sacred and holy, about the gospel and history and the nature of Western history and religious and cultural history in general. But it's a contribution. It's not a final key. It's not the answer. It belongs within a larger inventory of critical advantages. As long as that's not forgotten, one does well to attend to his arguments.
Yeah. Oh, God rest him. Well, internets, goodbye.
Who is she? That's the internet.
I don't know. Thanks, David, for your time. All right.